Just after midnight on the 30th of July, 1945, a Japanese submarine commander named Machitsura Hashimoto pressed his eye to a periscope and watched a warship die. The sea around him was the Philippine Sea, black and warm, somewhere between Guam and Leyte, 600 miles from the nearest land that mattered. There was a low moon behind his boat, I-58, throwing his silhouette away from the target and lighting the target for him instead. He had spotted the shape on the horizon nearly 40 minutes earlier and for a long moment could not decide what he was looking at. Too big for a destroyer, no escort visible anywhere around it. He guessed battleship. He was wrong, but the mistake did not matter because whatever it was alone and it was his. He gave the order to dive to periscope depth, close the gap, and did the arithmetic a submarine captain does in his head under pressure: target speed, target bearing, the spread of his shot wide enough that no turn the enemy made could save it. At 2 minutes past midnight, he fired 6 torpedoes in a fan across the water. Then he waited, counting seconds the way a man counts breaths when he isn't sure he'll get another chance. 3 explosions came back to him across the black water. He would later describe watching columns of fire and spray leap into the night, and the swell of controlled elation on his own boat, men who had spent years without so much as a confirmed kill, finally believing they had won. He gave the order to take I-58 deep, to run and hide from the destroyers that should, by every rule of naval doctrine, have been coming. No destroyers came. There was no counterattack. There was, for hours, no answer of any kind. When he surfaced again, the horizon where the ship had been was empty. It did not take him long to understand what that meant. Something enormous had gone under in the middle of the Pacific, and nobody on the American side seemed to know it yet. This is not a story about which sailors were braver, or which Navy fought harder in the summer of 1945. Both sides had already proven what they were capable of by then, at a cost nobody needed restated. This is a story about a single American warship, the men who never came home from it, and the extraordinary fact that the enemy who sank it ended up, more than half a century later, fighting to clear the name of the American officer who commanded it. The ship was the USS Indianapolis, and the truth of what happened to her, the truth that would take the United States Navy decades to fully admit, came, in the end, as much from the mouth of Machitsura Hashimoto as it did from any American source. To understand why that matters, you first have to understand what the Indianapolis was, and what she had just finished doing before Hashimoto ever found her in his periscope. She was a Portland-class heavy cruiser, laid down in 1930 in Camden, New Jersey, and by 1945 she was no ordinary ship. She was the flagship of the Fifth Fleet, the vessel that had carried Admiral Raymond Spruance through some of the largest naval campaigns of the entire Pacific War: Tarawa, the Marshall Islands, the Marianas, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. In March of 1945, off Okinawa, a Japanese kamikaze aircraft had put a bomb through her deck that killed 9 of her crew and forced her back to California for repairs. She was still being patched up when, in July, she received an assignment unlike anything given to a single warship in that entire war. On the 16th of July, 1945, Indianapolis departed San Francisco carrying a cargo her own crew was not permitted to know about. Locked in a specially welded compartment on the deck was a lead-lined canister. Inside it, enriched uranium and critical components for the first atomic bomb ever intended for combat use, the weapon that would be called Little Boy. 2 Army officers came aboard to guard it personally, men the crew were told were artillery officers, though nobody quite believed that. The ship set a speed record on the run to Pearl Harbor that would stand for decades. She continued on alone, unescorted, racing at nearly 30 knots, and on the 26th of July she reached the island of Tinian and unloaded her cargo under the eyes of admirals who offered no explanation. 9 days later, the world would understand exactly what had been on that ship. Her mission complete, Indianapolis was ordered onward to Leyte in the Philippines to join a training group ahead of the planned invasion of Japan itself. And this is where the story's first real institutional failure begins, because Indianapolis sailed that final leg the same way she had crossed the Pacific, alone. No escort ship, no destroyer screen. Command believed wrongly that the route was safe. Nobody told Captain Charles Butler McVeigh, her commanding officer, that naval intelligence had picked up signs of Japanese submarine activity along his exact path. McVeigh's standing orders gave him discretion to zigzag, the old evasive tactic of changing course at intervals to throw off a submarine's torpedo solution, at his discretion, weather permitting. On the night of the 29th of July, with visibility poor and the moon coming and going behind cloud, McVeigh judged zigzagging unnecessary and turned in for the night. It was a judgment call fully within his authority. It would come to define and nearly destroy the rest of his life. Waiting in that stretch of ocean was I-58, one of only a handful of large Japanese submarines still capable of offensive patrol that late in the war. Her commander, Machitsura Hashimoto, was 35 years old, the son of a Shinto priest from Kyoto, a career naval officer who had been aboard a Japanese submarine during the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. He had spent most of the Pacific War aboard one boat or another, coastal patrol craft, training submarines, and finally I-58 herself, a boat modern enough to carry Japan's kite-and-manned suicide torpedoes, though on this particular patrol she carried only conventional weapons. By the summer of 1945, Hashimoto had commanded a string of Japanese submarines and had yet to sink a single enemy ship outright. Japan's submarine fleet by this stage of the war had been devastated. Of roughly 190 submarines Japan had put into service, well over 100 had already been lost to Allied ships, aircraft, and other submarines. The men still on patrol in the summer of 1945 knew, better than almost anyone else in the Imperial Japanese Navy, exactly how badly the war had turned. Command doctrine had never been generous toward submarine crews to begin with. Japanese naval planners had built their submarine force to scout for the surface fleet rather than to hunt merchant shipping the way German U-boats did, and it showed in how few kills their remaining boats had to their name. Hashimoto had spent most of the war patrolling and training rather than fighting, watching friends and fellow commanders go out and simply never return. He went out on this final patrol carrying, by his own account after the war, a private fear that he would finish the conflict having sunk nothing at all, that he would be one of the ones who had gone through everything and proven nothing. Some of his own crew had gone years without hearing a single torpedo find its mark, and by July of 1945, the men of I-58 had learned to read that silence as a kind of verdict on themselves. I-58 left port on the 16th of July, 1945, the same day, though neither side could have known it, that Indianapolis departed San Francisco carrying her own secret cargo toward the far side of the same ocean. Hashimoto's orders sent him into a stretch of shipping lanes between Guam and the Philippines, a route American planners considered safe enough that no escort vessels had been assigned to patrol it. For nearly 2 weeks he found nothing worth a torpedo. Then on the night of the 29th of July, running on the surface to recharge his batteries, lookouts on I spotted a shape against the horizon, roughly 10,000 meters out, silhouetted for just a moment by a moon that had broken through the cloud cover long enough to betray it. So when a large, unescorted, unidentified silhouette appeared on his horizon just before midnight on the 29th of July, Hashimoto did not hesitate the way a cautious commander might have. He assumed, reasonably enough given Japanese battle doctrine of the period, that any lone ship that far from land in that stretch of ocean, moving without visible escort, was either something being deliberately risked or something the enemy did not expect to need protecting. He had no way of knowing what he was actually looking at. He simply knew it was big, it was alone, and after years of empty patrols, it was finally in front of him. The attack itself took only minutes. Hashimoto closed to roughly 1.5 miles, submerged to periscope depth, and worked through the calculations of range, bearing, and speed that would let him strike the target however it moved. Believing he was looking at a battleship, he chose to fire not a single torpedo but a full fan of 6, spread wide enough that even a last-second change of course would not save the ship. At 2 minutes past midnight on the 30th of July, he gave the order to fire. Aboard Indianapolis, most of the crew were below decks, off watch, asleep in the heat of a Pacific night. 2 torpedoes struck home within seconds of each other, one near the bow, one closer to midships, and the damage was catastrophic almost immediately. The explosion forward tore away a section of the bow entirely. Fuel and ammunition stores near the point of impact ignited, and fire raced back through compartments that moments before had been full of sleeping men. Within moments, Indianapolis had lost the ability to send a reliable distress signal. Later investigation would suggest a signal may have gone out on backup power, but it was never acted upon by anyone who received it, one more link in a chain of failures that would leave the ship's fate unknown for days. Captain McVeigh, thrown from his bunk by the force of the explosions, made his way to the bridge to find a ship already listing hard to starboard and taking water fast. Power was gone throughout most of the ship. With no working intercom, the order to abandon ship had to be passed by word of mouth, sailor to sailor, through passageways already filling with smoke, fuel fumes, and rising seawater, an order that some men below decks never received at all. Those who could reach the deck grabbed whatever life jackets or kapok vests remained and went over the side into water thick with fuel oil, joining hundreds of others already struggling in the dark. The ship rolled onto her side as she settled. Her screws, still slowly turning, rose briefly into the moonlit air before the whole hull slid under. From the first torpedo strike to the moment the sea closed over her, barely 12 minutes had passed, not enough time for many of the men trapped in the lower decks to have any chance at all. Of the approximately 1,195 men aboard, some 300 went down with the ship in those 12 minutes alone. That left close to 900 men in the open ocean, most with nothing but a kapok life jacket or a floating net between them and the sea, 600 miles from the nearest island, with no rescue on the way, because, as far as the United States Navy's own tracking system was concerned, nothing was wrong. Nobody had reported the ship overdue. A clerical and procedural failure, later documented in painstaking detail by the Navy's own investigators, meant that when Indianapolis failed to arrive at Leyte on schedule, no one raised an alarm. She was simply logged incorrectly as having arrived. What followed in the water was 4.5 days that would become one of the worst survival ordeals in the history of the United States Navy. The men had almost no fresh water and no rations to speak of. Many wore only kapok life jackets, which soaked through and lost their buoyancy after roughly 48 hours, forcing exhausted men to fight simply to keep their heads above the surface. Salt water and fuel oil caused burns to skin and eyes, and men driven by thirst to drink seawater suffered hallucinations, seizures, and death within hours. Groups drifted apart from one another in the current, some clustered in the hundreds around the few life rafts and floater nets that had come free of the ship, others scattered alone or in pairs across miles of open water with nothing to hold on to at all. The sun during the day blistered exposed skin. The cold at night sapped strength from bodies already failing from exhaustion and dehydration. And the sharks came, oceanic white-tip sharks drawn by blood, by fuel oil, and by the noise and vibration of hundreds of thrashing men, began picking off the weakest and the dead in the water, a horror that repeated itself day after day as survivors watched companions disappear beneath the surface one at a time, sometimes within arm's reach. Historians studying the tragedy have estimated that shark attacks may have accounted for a substantial share of the deaths in the water. Some estimates run into the hundreds, though the exact number can never be known with certainty, since so many bodies were never recovered and so many deaths went unwitnessed in the dark. By the time rescue came, men who had entered the water as trained sailors were, by survivor accounts, barely recognizable as themselves, sunburned past the point of blistering, coated in oil, many no longer able to tell hallucination from reality. The rescue that finally came was not the result of any search, it was an accident. On the 2nd of August, a Navy patrol bomber flying a routine mission spotted an oil slick and, descending to investigate, saw men in the water, hundreds of them, spread across miles of ocean. Ships were diverted at once. Over the following day and night, survivors were pulled from the sea, many so delirious with thirst and exhaustion that they fought their rescuers, convinced the approaching sailors were another hallucination. When the count was finally taken, of the 1,195 men who had sailed from Guam, only 316 were alive. Roughly 880 sailors and Marines had died, one of the single costliest losses of life the United States Navy suffered in the entire war, rivaled almost exactly by the loss of the Arizona at Pearl Harbor nearly 4 years earlier. The Navy's need to explain such a catastrophe led, within months, to a decision almost without precedent. Captain Charles McVeigh was court-martialed, the only commanding officer in the history of the United States Navy to face court-martial for the loss of a ship sunk by an act of war. And to secure a conviction, Navy prosecutors did something that had never been done before in an American court-martial. They flew the enemy commander who had sunk the ship halfway around the world to testify against the American captain who had lost it. Machitsura Hashimoto arrived in Washington in December of 1945, only months after Japan's surrender, treated not as a prisoner but as a naval officer summoned as a witness. By his own later account, relayed through those who spoke with him, he was frightened of what awaited him, uncertain whether he was walking into a courtroom or an execution. He testified on the 13th of December, becoming the first officer of a former enemy nation ever to testify against a United States officer in an American court-martial. And what he said on the stand should have ended the case against McVeigh before it began. Hashimoto told the court under oath that visibility on the night of the attack had been good enough that he located and tracked the Indianapolis without difficulty, and that whether the ship had been zigzagging or running a straight course would have made no difference whatsoever to the outcome. He had positioned his boat, timed his spread of torpedoes, and calculated his firing solution specifically to account for a possible change in course. Zigzagging, he told the court, would not have saved the ship. Prosecutors also called an American submarine officer, Commander Glenn Donahoe, who testified that zigzagging offered little real protection against a submarine in a good firing position, testimony that lined up almost exactly with what the enemy commander himself had just told the court. The Navy prosecuted McVeigh anyway and convicted him anyway on the charge of hazarding his vessel by failing to zigzag. It was a verdict that stood at odds with the enemy's own sworn testimony and even at odds with the American Navy's own submarine warfare experts, who separately told the court that zigzagging against a submarine of that era carried little proven value in the first place. Even Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, one of the most respected commanders in American naval history, would later note that McVeigh's orders had explicitly left the decision to his own discretion, a fact his own defense counsel never fully argued at trial. Nimitz ultimately remitted McVeigh's sentence and allowed him to retire quietly with the rank of Rear Admiral. But the conviction stood, and the anger of grieving families did not go away with a remitted sentence. For the rest of his life, Charles McVeigh received hate mail from relatives of men who had died in the water, blaming him personally for their loss. In November of 1968, worn down by decades of that grief and blame, McVeigh took his own life. Hashimoto, for his part, went home to a country in ruins and to news that reshaped the rest of his life in a way almost too cruel to be believed. In the weeks after the sinking, before Japan's surrender, an American B dropped the very weapon Indianapolis had delivered to Tinian onto the city of Hiroshima. Hashimoto's own family was in Hiroshima when the bomb fell. He returned from his final war patrol, having sunk the ship that carried the bomb's components across the Pacific, to learn that the bomb itself had killed people he loved. The war had connected him to the Indianapolis twice over, in ways neither he nor anyone aboard that cruiser could ever have imagined on the night the torpedoes struck. He left the Navy, worked for a time running a repatriation ship bringing Japanese servicemen home, and eventually became a Shinto priest, following the path his own father had walked before him. But he never stopped thinking about the men who died because of what he had done in the dark that July night, and he never stopped believing that an injustice had been done to the man he had testified against. In December of 1990, 45 years after the sinking, Hashimoto traveled to Pearl Harbor to meet with a group of Indianapolis survivors face to face. Speaking through a translator, he told them simply that he had come to pray with them for the shipmates whose deaths he had caused. One of the survivors in the room, a Marine named Giles McCoy, who had spent 4.5 days in that same shark-infested water, looked at the man who had fired the torpedoes and told him, "I forgive you." That reconciliation carried Hashimoto into the final act of the story, and it is the act that makes this account worth telling at all. In the late 1990s, surviving crewmen of the Indianapolis, joined by a schoolboy named Hunter Scott, who had become fascinated by the case after watching a movie, launched a renewed campaign to clear Charles McVeigh's name once and for all. In 1999, Machitsura Hashimoto, the same man who had once been flown to Washington by the United States Navy specifically to testify against McVeigh, wrote a letter to the United States Senate Armed Services Committee, adding his voice to the survivors fighting for their former captain. He repeated what he had said under oath more than 5 decades earlier, that he would have sunk the Indianapolis whether she had been zigzagging or not, and he went further, writing words that closed the circle of the entire war between their two nations. "Our peoples have forgiven each other for that terrible war and its consequences," he wrote. "Perhaps it is time your peoples forgave Captain McVeigh for the humiliation of his unjust conviction." The letter helped move a resolution that had been stalled for years. On the 12th of October 2000, the United States Congress passed a resolution exonerating Charles McVeigh of responsibility for the loss of his ship, a measure signed into law by President Bill Clinton on the 30th of October. Machitsura Hashimoto did not live to see it signed. He died on the 25th of October 2000 at the age of 91, 5 days before the American government he had once testified before finally admitted, officially, that the man he sank a ship out from under had never deserved to be blamed for it. There is no clean moral to draw a line under here, no tidy final sentence that resolves what happened in that water in the summer of 1945. What there is, instead, is a single fact that outlasted the war itself. The enemy who fired the torpedoes spent the last years of his life trying to undo the injustice that followed them. Somewhere off the coast of the Philippines, underwater none of them ever expected to rest in, the men of the Indianapolis are still down there. And the last word on what happened to their captain came not from the country that court-martialed him, but from the man in the periscope who never stopped believing McVeigh deserved better than what his own Navy gave him.